suppose I just wanted to share my story with you guys. I suppose I'd first like to start off with explaining who I am. I am an Australian. I am of a Sinhala and Tamil background, so my grandmother is a Sinhala woman and on my mother's side, and then the rest of my family are Tamil. And in 2004, I got the opportunity to go to Sri Lanka to discover my Sri Lankan roots, both Sinhala and Tamil. And while I was there, I truly fell in love with the place and the people, and I stayed. I found it, I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen photos. It's a very natural and a very simple lifestyle, especially in sort of the rural areas of Sri Lanka, but it is simply a very beautiful place. But unfortunately, I was forced out of Sri Lanka. This was because where I was living, which was in the northern region of Sri Lanka, which was under the LTT control, became the place where a very brutal war happened. And while I was there, I witnessed the massacre of hundreds and thousands of people and was lucky enough to escape alive. And what I suppose after 2 years I've thought to come out and share my story is because 2 years down the track, nothing has really changed for the Tamil people. Because most of the people that did get affected by this war were Tamil. And saying that, it wasn't exclusively Tamil. There were Sinhala people that were living, many of them were intermarried, or there was also Muslim Tamils that were living there, and they too were subject to this war. And unfortunately, the main perpetrator of this war was the very government that was meant to protect them. In Australia, one of the things we take for granted is that our government will protect us, and unfortunately in countries like Sri Lanka, this is not a reality. When I say I saw the massacre of people, I literally mean that. I saw hospitals being bombed. I witnessed the death of so many people that by the end it became almost something that I was desensitized to. I remember I was on one occasion helping out at the hospital, and despite the fact that I have minimal, if not none, no experience in medicine, I was asked to help with giving injections to people to avoid them getting septic wounds. And this was towards the end of the war, and we had little children coming in with head injuries, old women who just died, leaving behind a whole family. So much trauma that, you know, I can remember just having to walk around with these penicillin injections and, you know, administer them to as many people as I could. And the even more tragic aspect of that was after 2 days of that, we ran out of medicine. And so we couldn't continue it. And I saw people who had maggots in their wounds. And, you know, this was a result of the blockade of medical equipment coming to that area. I also remember a doctor, a friend of mine, who was staying in the same tent as I was, and I didn't go on that certain day, and instead of she coming back to me that night when she wanted to show me her wedding photos, I went to her funeral. And it happened while she was, you know, administering a patient. And what was really sad about that was that, you know, I could have been there, but I wasn't. So I only went after the event, and I saw the debris, and I saw, you know, tarpaulin sheets where people were lying before, now being the site of just blood. And they had come there to try and get their lives saved, and instead, that's where their lives were finally taken away from them. I saw school kids go through like amazing trauma every time there was an aerial attack. And it wasn't necessarily that the bombs fell on them, but rather that there was an aerial attack. And these children, just the sheer fear of the noise and the pain it caused them, would go hysterical, children would faint. And I remember feeling really quite helpless while I was there. And I tried my best to do things like run little workshops with the kids and try and make them forget the war, but the war just became so intensive that was just the reality for a lot of people. And towards the end, children just lived in bunkers and they didn't come out because that was the only way their parents hoped to save their lives. There was extreme malnourishment, so I remember while I was eating once, this severely impoverished child coming up to me and begging me for some food, and I hadn't seen such poverty in that area for the many years that I was there. And I remember thinking, if I gave this child a little bit of food, then all the families that were around us would also come, and I don't have that much food. And having to tell the boy to go away and then going to where he was, and where he was his mother was lying under a tractor, and she had severe fever, she didn't know where her husband was, she had a baby that was 6 months old, and she was just using the tractor as some sort of protection from the shelling. And this was the general reality of the life of the people in that area for several months. I saw attacks on food lines, so people would line up to get food and that place would get shelled. And the food that they were going to get was 1 tumbler of sugar and 2 kilograms of flour, and that was going to be what was going to keep them going for weeks. And just seeing that place getting bombed, and I saw shelling from the sea, and just all these experiences I saw with my own eyes. And I had personal losses as well. Some of you all might know that I actually was pregnant towards the end, and my child got killed, was stillborn. And I don't know where my partner is today. And I have had to try and deal with this, and I've tried to sort of bury the memories, like many survivors do. And I'm sure there's many of you all in this audience who are survivors, or friends of survivors, or family members of survivors. You know what I'm talking about when this effort is made to just try and put a memory under the carpet. But unfortunately, it doesn't leave you. And it was, this quest for me to find a reason for why it happened. Why did I go through that? And it was also the fact that 2 years down the track, the perpetrators of this were getting away with it. And that injustice was something that I felt I had to act upon. And that is the only reason I've decided to come and tell my story. That is justice. And this quest for justice is, I suppose, where I'm reaching out to you all. The Australian population, the world population, the Sinhala people, the moderate Sinhala people that understand that what happened in their land was not right and want to actually make amends with their neighbors. And of course the Tamil people, who many of you all have been through even worse experiences than I, and have found refuge in Australia. I reach out to you all to try and ask you to also share your experiences. And despite knowing that it is actually quite a confronting thing, because there is the vigilance of the Sri Lankan government, who I'm sure is present here with mobile phones staring at me right now. I can even point them out if I wanted to. And the next thing would be that they'll be accusing everyone that comes out to speak about their experiences, LTT or pro-LTT and so forth, in this effort to try and hide the truth that they know happened. And yet there is so many Sri Lankan people that I know, because my family, a lot of them are Sinhala. And I love them and they love me, and I know that they would never do anything to hurt me. And yet, it is their government that hurt me, and that's something a lot of them find very difficult to deal with. But unfortunately, I suppose in parallel to the situation of the Jews in Israel that are uncomfortable with what's happening to the Palestinians, it's really time for the singular people to get up and say, you know, I'm not comfortable with what's happening. And I mean, keep in mind, it's not just the Tamil people that are being persecuted. I remember reading the letter by Lasantha Wickramasinghe, who is the senior editor of one of the biggest papers in Sri Lanka. And I remember getting a really eerie feeling about it, because he writes that I know who's going to kill me. And he writes this letter and he tells them openly, if I die, and you read it and you sort of realize that the state of Sri Lanka is being led by what is essentially an autocratic government, and it is doing all its people a disservice, and it's getting away with it. And I suppose that's where we have to recognize that for all the survivors of injustice, there will be no peace until they feel that there has been a genuine effort to get justice. And there is no point talking about reconciliation until you talk about justice first. And that is actually recognizing who the perpetrators are. So 2 years on, I have the memory of a couple of events that has actually been crucial to making me want to share my story, and I'll just share them with you, I suppose. And I'll ask you, if you were in my position, would you do anything different? One of them was towards the end. I was walking towards it was a contaminated water well, in the sense that the water wasn't clean. And at that stage, water was really hard to get by. And I wasn't going to drink the water, but it was just for sort of cleaning and whatnot. And I remember walking past, and there was this girl, little girl, in a sort of eye-shaped bunker. And she asked me, please, can you just give me some water? And the thing about this child was that she had one leg below her knee and one leg above her knee and had no feet. And, you know, in a usual event, all of us would, you know, give a jugful. But I couldn't then. I had to walk away, because if I did give her water, she would have to drink contaminated water, and the result of that would be that she potentially would get diarrhea. And being a girl with no legs, that isn't undesirable. You know, I couldn't do that either, and so I walked away. And then there was another event where, towards the end of the war, I was walking to surrender to the Sri Lankan armed forces, and with all the civilian population, like hundreds and thousands of us. And I remember seeing all these people who had like severe injury, like skeletons, lying around near like vehicles, sort of stretching their arms out and begging us to take them with them. And, you know, we're talking about just bones. And in hindsight, for me, it was like these skeletons of hope were begging us to save their lives, and I couldn't, because I had my own family and my own self to protect, that I couldn't take on another burden at the time. But today, I am living in Australia with my family, and I have that luxury. And I think a lot of us here do have that luxury to actually give life to some of this hope that, in many respects, has died in Sri Lanka or anywhere in the world, where they live like zombies. And I remember an Australian photographer who went from Melbourne, and she sort of smuggled her way into Sri Lanka's, you know, sort of undisclosed area where it was separated by the armed forces and you couldn't get in. And she had taken these amazing footage, and she brought them and she sort of exhibited them in Australia. And I remember looking at the photos, and looking at it and thinking, oh, I really don't want to go back to that, because what's there now is just so desperate. And I remember her telling me that she spoke to so many of them single women with children, whose husbands are either killed or are in detention, with army posts every 50 meters or so around them. And I mean, I don't need to expand on that. The less disrupt your imagination as to how unsafe and potentially abusive that situation is for them. And it is abusive for them. Like, a lot of them did share stories of being violated. And she said they have lost hope because they don't think about anything but the day. And I think we have the luxury to think ahead and do what we can to try and at least instill a little bit of hope in the lives of these desperate people. And I suppose that's why I'm, reaching out to the world today to ask you to help the survivors of war in Sri Lanka. And I think, without sounding too confronting about this, I think there is also a portion of blame that needs to be taken by the world population, especially countries who assisted in the war. And we're talking about 20 plus countries that provided military assistance to the Sri Lankan government to commit this acts of, what I would believe, acts of genocide, acts of wars, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in general. And especially with regard to the Commonwealth countries, starting with the United Kingdom, who were the very country who created this problem on the island by unifying what was essentially two different people and trying to create a unified state and leaving, and as a result creating this whole sequence of huge problems that has come. And I think we as Australians care beyond just racial reasons. We care because of humanity. And I think the problems of the fact that even today there is singular people that are being killed. There are, refugees in Australia that are from minority parties that are singular who have also suffered as a result of the government's acts of inhumanity and injustice. I think it's really important that everyone sort of gets together and tries to decide what it is that Australia is going to do when the president of Sri Lanka comes to our land. And do we want him to come to our land? And are we happy that the High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, who lives in Canberra in a luxury house, is also was also the Navy Admiral at the time of the end of the war, and in charge of the Navy and its decisions that it made when it fired upon the civilian population. And I suppose one of the things that I remember is that being a survivor of war is not just about having experienced it directly or having witnessed crimes yourself. There is also the survivors, which are the extended family. And I remember having a discussion with a Bengali taxi driver in Sydney when he said, "You're not the only one that survived the war, your whole family did. And my whole family in Australia did survive the war because they lived with the constant fear of whether that I would come back alive or not." And even today, when I choose to share my story, my family are also reliving this experience because indefinitely there will be an onslaught on me about criticizing and accusing me of all kinds of things from the Sri Lankan government and its supporters. And so I know it's hard for the average person who has survived war to decide that they're going to stand up for justice and actually say this is not right. But the more of us that do it, the more of us that come in front, this random accusations that the government makes will also have less of a meaning. And there will be a voice for justice. And I think this time where CHOGM is around the corner is a perfect time to try and actually stand up for what you can do. You know, what would you have done if you had seen that child in that bunker? And many of you all have seen worse things. And time for you all to sort of go, right, I have to do something about this. And I mean, keep in mind, this is the very Australia that is going to let Mahinda Rajapaksa into its country, but also has detained thousands of people who are survivors of war and are waiting for their security clearance to be made when they have actually experienced the trauma and the tortures attached to being survivors of war. And I suppose I'd just like to finish up by just saying that, you know, I myself have dreams. I have dreams that I will have a family and children and live happily in Australia, but I also am aware that the people back in Sri Lanka who survived the war also have these very dreams. And unfortunately, here I don't need anyone else's assistance to get my dreams.